Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our third and final session for today. And for the third session, we have Professor Christine Helmer, who is the Peter Ritzmer Professor of the Humanities at Northwestern University. Her research specialization is Christian theology with particular attention to German intellectual history, including Martin Luther, Friedrich Schleiermacher, and early 20th century Luther Renaissance. And for our conference today, Professor Helmer will speak to us about the issue of gender in the context of genealogy. Her paper is entitled Genealogy, a Theological Account. All yours, Christine.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And also to my colleagues, I'm excited to discuss with you the critical and constructive project of genealogy as we can appropriate this method of looking at transhistorical change for the contemporary moment. I have three sections of my paper. The first section focuses mostly on analyzing how value has come to inflect contemporary historiography. And I see genealogy as being part of that project. I won't go into the details. Darren's paper on taking a theological critical look at a genealogy of decline is something that I am also interested in. I would like to begin with one proposal on how genealogy can be repurposed for the contemporary moment, and before I then begin reading my paper from section 2. So there is another more productive way in which theological genealogy can be repurposed. This is the kind of forensic historiography that Cyril O'Regan has produced in his narratives of modernity. I have learned much from his account of how modern German idealism appropriated Gnostic resources and epistemologies. This is particularly clear in Hegel's use of Böhme and Schelling's use of Oettinger, a favorite in 18th century Swabian pietism. In my own work, I have used forensic historiography in order to explain the history of ideas as structural developments that can explain why people tend towards believing particular possibilities over others. For example, the reception of Luther in early 20th century contexts of the Luther Renaissance and the emerging dialectical theology, which included emerging conversations with the social sciences, laid the resources for the modern study of religion and the political theology of fascism. Forensic historiography, a particular deployment of genealogy, is a useful tool to reconstruct particular moves in the history of ideas in order to explain how ideas combine and divide so that they can be better understood as functions of structures embedded in social, political, and cultural aspects without losing their theological integrity. What does gender have to do with genealogy? On the surface, a survey of the gender of theologians and philosophers writing genealogies discloses the rather obvious point. It is white men who, for the most part, are the producers of this genre. This obvious point has to do with the broader point, painfully obvious to some and entirely oblivious to others, that white men have for millennia and can continue to be the main producers and consumers of theology and philosophy. Take any contemporary book or article in theology or philosophy and look at the bibliography. And I challenge all my fellow colleagues at this conference to look at the bibliography and footnotes of their own papers and see which gender is and race is represented there. But for the most part, these contemporary authors and creators of discussants and footnotes and bibliographies follow what has gone on for centuries, that women and people of color are consistently and perniciously erased from the public record. The question of erasure sadly underlies the production of genealogies. It is ironic that the erasure of women is inscribed into the genealogical project, at least as it has been undertaken so far. The Greek term genus, embedded in the word genealogy, means offspring, progeny, and family. The English term generation is derived from the Greek root. To engender or generate means to conceive and to give birth. The gender essentially responsible for generating the human species in a sequence of generation is, of course, women. Matrilineal succession is the reason for the human race existing as it does in subsequent generations. The English term gender is also derived from genus, inflected by the specific Latin translation of the Aristotelian use of the term genus to signify species or kind. Gender, thus, at its classic philological root, means genus, species, or kind, Gattung in German. This is all to say that species and family inform the root term in the word under the microscope, namely genealogy. And on this basis, genealogy can easily be exchanged for gendereology without any significant shift in the term's meaning. The intriguing and essentialist point is that genealogy could be taken to refer to the generations of the human race propagated by biological reproduction in matrilineal succession. In that case, gendereology would be a very different project than the one it has come to mean by theologians and philosophers interested in tracing transhistorical shifts in ideas embodied by male rationality. In this sense, we see that genealogy has subverted, erased, to be more precise, the original meaning of genealogy as gendereology. The will to power in the world as it erases gender and insists on co-opting generation as the masculine prerogative. The metaphysic of the will to power reveals this erasure of gender as genealogy. The logos displaced from matrilineal succession to the apostolic succession, so that women are erased and disenfranchised from their participation in the generative process. But why? I live close to Lake Michigan, the southernmost of the 5 Great Lakes along the Canada-US border. Lake Michigan is the only lake that lies to the south of the 49th parallel, strung between the Midwestern states of Wisconsin to the west and Michigan to the east. I live in a dog-exuberant town in which the beach is frequented by dogs taking their human companions on early morning walks. On some days when the clouds are so thick that Chicago's John Hancock Tower is invisible to the south, the waves on the beach are churning up. Usually the east wind brings the storms and with them the highest waves, as dogs chase each other on the beach and dig holes before their companions can yell at them to stop. One wave rises at a time from the water, forms a crest before curling forward and being absorbed into the waters from which it emerged. Wave after wave, each wave becoming visible only to disappear as it moves quickly toward the shore. It is telling that the story of feminism in the 20th century uses the metaphor of waves. The term feminism, first coined in the first half of the 19th century in French, soon made its way into various linguistic vocabularies. Its story in the West over the past 2 centuries is periodized into 4 waves, each wave an umbrella term for a particular historical epoch that focused feminism on particular legal, social, and political challenges. I'm not going to rehearse or recapitulate the 4 waves of feminism. I do want to inscribe the names of some of the protagonists: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Rachel Den Hollander, and Tarana Burke. I retell the story of the 4 waves because the names of their protagonists and their commitments are only made present in memory by telling and retelling. As genealogies, the names of Kant and Hegel and Heidegger easily slip off our tongues. But can we recall the names of women who have constructed a gendereology of feminism? Each wave has its distinctive contours, its proponents, yet the struggles of women around the globe for the rights to own property and drive a car, for personal and public safety, for rights to control and regulate their own bodies, all these struggles continue in different ways in the contemporary period in different contexts. Furthermore, sometimes battles won during one wave are revoked in another. For example, the rights of suffrage from 1 century ago are currently threatened by attacks against the Voting Rights Bill, specifically aimed at women and people of color. The concerns of the personal as political continue to be a challenge in women's lives as they navigate their female bodies in private and public spaces. The consistent pressures of misogynist culture that twist a woman's no to a yes, that deny the truth of her words, and that suppress her voice and diminish her intellect are ongoing, pernicious realities experienced by every woman on this planet. The waves keep coming and crashing on the shores of the patriarchy that takes its revenge on every forward step of progress by pushing women a few steps backwards. Gendereology is not a story that accounts for decline or ascendance. Rather, waves capture different aspects to the many challenges of being embodied female in the modern world. They must constantly be remembered and fought for, lest their voices and stances be absorbed back into the patriarchy from which they emerged in protest. The successive invisibility of waves is one way of explaining the erasure of women in history. Yet let's take another direction by invoking psychoanalysis and language. Here we find another approach to conceptualizing women's erasure, or in other words, the erasure of genealogy. The power of genealogy is that it dictates the signifier. Signifiers are significant because of their fixing ability. In order for a subject to endure in time, a signifier is needed. Signifiers pick out objects and render them stable. But the same signifier refers to the object that, in spite of changes in its physical constitution, remains the same. In order to have continuity through time, the subject needs a signifier. In order to be remembered in subsequent tellings, the subject terms need to be referred to and again by their consistent signifiers. Those with power over the signifiers, namely the genealogists, dictate the terms of transhistorical fixity. They determine which signifiers extend coherently across temporal zones. Luther, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Foucault. These names are shorthand signifiers for particular concepts and ideas that are deemed significant for genealogy. Luther's freedom of the inner self, Kant's transcendental freedom, and so on. This genealogy has been etched into Western consciousness. Its performance inscribes the significance of these names and ideas as fixed through time. Although the ideas change, their fixity is established by the same signifying names and concepts. Genealogy is the act of performing the fixity of the signifiers. Their normativity then becomes obvious through the performance and their endless encores. And we have seen this so far already in the conference by the fixing of the name of Torrance. Let's get concrete. Academics have as their duty and vocations the production of knowledge. Yet their production takes place within genealogies. Knowledge is produced within communities that have histories. Teachers transmit their knowledge acquisition to the next generation that appropriates it with its own critical questioning. Dissertations are written by citing interlocutors past and present, and canons are thus recapitulated and developed. Bibliographies are compiled as representatives of the major authors who have contributed to the discussion at stake. All these practices in the production of knowledge rehearse genealogy. The signifiers, already fixed by transhistorical transitions, continue to inform the creation of footnotes and bibliographies in new works. A challenge to those who are writing dissertations. Discuss and stabilize through decades and perhaps centuries of canonical signifying are the shoulders on which new knowledge is produced. And that new knowledge reinscribes genealogy into the new while adding new fixtures to it, fixtures that are different, but in continuity with the older signifiers. Traditions are thus established, successions are preserved. There are many ways in which the fixing of the signifier occurs, through institutional power, through canonical reproduction, through repetition and testing. Their consistent recapitulation in transmission, appropriation, and development are performances of power. The power of these traditions of knowledge productions, their associations with institutional power, and their insistence that only one gender is capable of signification by fixed signifiers. Yet there are women who produce knowledge. Women, and I will end on this note, are the subjects in search of a signifier. Yet genealogy prohibits their inclusion by preventing them from fixing as signifiers. Their knowledge productions are auras, yet because they have no signifiers, their works never secure the necessary traces in genealogy that require recapitulation. Without a signifier, they remain an aura nebulous, a wave, the creativity of the free-floating signifieds, the aura to be feared and controlled by prohibiting fixity as a signifier. Genealogy thus promotes knowledge production precisely by erasing women's auras and prohibiting their traces. Women who break through, Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Avila, are the exceptions, fixed by papal canonization and usually used as excuses. But the majority of women who have written and who continue to write continue to be erased. This is the rule of genealogy. The value of genealogy is the prohibition of fixing women as signifiers. This is why feminism is caught up in waves that are constantly absorbed by the ocean, or why women authors are deliberately and consciously erased from the records, footnotes, bibliographies, and canons of discussion, why they are disappeared from genealogy. In my final section, which I won't go into detail, but you are free to ask me about, I look at a constructive proposal based on something similar to what Darren had talked about, a theology of rupture. And I look at genealogy as a way of looking at linear time. And I invoke a theology of rupture in order to show that this is precisely where women theologians and people of color are constantly located because of their lack of a signifier. And this is the place of creativity and inviting reflection on how to live in an age of impending apocalypse that has been created by genealogy. I thank you all for listening, and I look forward to a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, for raising a very important topic for our discussion, especially how the sources and what has been recorded and what has not been noticed. That's always had been a huge concern for genealogists. And so it's now a great delight for me to introduce my colleague in Cambridge, Ruth Jackson Ravenscroft, as a respondent. Ruth is fellow and tutor at Sydney Sussex College and convenes an MPhil course entitled Gender and Christian Theology at the Faculty of Divinity. Her research sits at the intersection of theology, philosophy, literature, and intellectual history, with particular interest in hermeneutics, religious language, gender, and epistemology. So I hand over to you, Ruth, now to respond to Christine's paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pui, and thank you very much, Christine. This is going to be quite a scrappy and open response, but it's an attempt to think with Christine about these issues on this topic that we have before us. And I noted in Pui's introduction to the whole conference at the beginning, you framed genealogy as a genre of writing. And I think it's important to mention that because this is my entry personally into genealogy. I'm a person, as a theologian, interested in the way that theologians write. You know, my work is largely focused on Friedrich Schleiermacher, and I'm very interested in the way that Schleiermacher deliberately, like his romantic contemporaries, you know, the 19th century is an age of experimentation, of poetry, of myth making, and he joins them in very deliberately writing in different contexts, in different ways to different audiences, using specific genres, using specific literary forms. So when he writes about the incarnation, he writes in dialogue. When he writes about the ethics of the self, he writes in soliloquy. When he writes his Christian dogmatics, he does it in a kind of very didactic, systematic way. So similarly, I'm interested as someone invested in genealogy as one way of doing theological engagement among many others. And I think that's where it has its place for me personally, not as an overarching way of conducting theology, but as Christina said, a helpful tool. And that language of tool is one I'll come back to at the end of this response. So the response I'll give, the way of thinking with Christine that I have, hinges on the motif, sort of motif of perspective that Christine introduces in the written paper that I've had access to, because at the very beginning of that paper, she juxtaposes the way that a novelist is concerned with human action to the way that a historian might be concerned with human action. And of course, in a novelist like Dickens, and Christine quotes from the opening lines of A Tale of Two Cities, we inevitably are able to access from a novelist perspective, especially someone like Dickens or someone like Dostoevsky who write polyphonically, human experience seen from different sides. So in A Tale of Two Sissies, we see things from above, but also from below. And that's the ability of the novelist to do that in a way that the historian, Christine, suggests is often called to write in an objective voice, is often called to be disinterested about their subject material. And so the experience of the human is not necessarily foregrounded. So taking this theme of perspective, I wanted to look first, mention, I suppose, the aspect of perspective, the perspective of the theologian writer who's accessing genealogies. What does the potential writer of genealogies, what can genealogy do to their perspective on things? Secondly, can a consideration of different metaphors change our perspective on the limits of genealogy? And this is one of the real central strengths and excellencies of Christine's paper, that she brings to our attention this metaphor of waves. And I think it's a really helpful thing to think with. And then finally, I'm going to say some sort of very gestural things about the metaphor, which you get in Schleiermacher, which may seem quite saccharine, of wholeness, actually, a metaphor of wholeness for conceiving the human condition, not as a sort of binary, disrupted, sort of fractured thing, but as a churning nexus of wholeness. And it's that vision of human nature that I think could be a very potent one behind the way, it should be behind the way that we construct genealogies. And I think it's a feminist perspective, is one of the perspectives that can help us get there. So just to run through these three different points I want to make. Firstly, this very banal point of how important genealogies have become for the perspective of theologian writers. So we'll hear throughout the conference about how genealogy is a tool, and how, I think Darren in his written paper mentioned that for Foucault, it's a way of responding to a particular historical situation in a way that we understand that situation not to have been fated. Foucault can help us to sort of rip up the contingencies at the roots of every twist and turn in society's development. And in this way, genealogy can kind of be a kind of therapy, a kind of way of being kind of a philosopher therapist. It shows us, genealogy can show us that we do not need to take every element of the present for granted. But it's also, and Christine is, when she goes concrete in her paper she says, academics have as their duty and vocation the production of knowledge. We insert ourselves now into that genealogical development of course, as people producing knowledge, preserving the people that are going to be studied, the people who won't be studied. And it's that, I think the weight of that responsibility is caught up with us as academics, as historians, as theologians. And so I think now this task of doing genealogy is invading the anxious nooks and crannies of ourselves when we go about writing our books. As a theologian writing about Schleiermacher, I had to prefix in my introduction, I engaged with the genealogy of the development of theology as a discipline in the university, which is a really important discussion within how did theology emerge? What relation does it bear to its twin sister, religious studies? In the modern academy, is the theological and the historical, have they been torn apart? Is there a place for theology in the university? All of these sorts of questions about who we are as academics. Do I have a place in the academy as a theologian anymore? All of these questions that we have about validity of our writing, who it's speaking to, who it's representing. Those things, I think genealogy unavoidably has invaded our sense of selves as we go about writing our texts. And I think this is a positive thing as well as a very difficult thing to come to terms with. So in that sense, I think genealogy can be a very good tool, because in one sense, it can be brought on board to work through not only who or what we should be blaming, for instance, for the decline of theological categories, but or the declension of the possibilities of belief, but it's also a tool for working through who our interlocutors should be in the present. Who should we be speaking to? Who should we be dialoguing? Who's helpful? Who's less helpful? Who has systemic injustices built into their system? So I think it can be a really, and this is part of the feminist task as well, to sort of use genealogies actively as a tool to unsettle, to rip the sort of carpet up and see what's underneath. But it's also it's also a tool in which we are able to challenge our own assumptions and expectations, to refine our shared narratives. And this is something, you know, even someone like Rowan Williams, he writes the following about good historical writing. He says, good historical writing, I suggest, is writing that constructs that sense of who we are by a real engagement with the strangeness of the past, that establishes my or our identity now as bound up with a whole range of things that are not easy for me or for us. So I think that's just where we are at the moment. It's a very basic point. I think we're all aware of the point I'm making, but I just wanted to sort of acknowledge it and sort of bring it into a breathing, give it a bit of breathing space in the conference. So secondly, this point about how we consider metaphor and considering different metaphors might be a helpful and useful way of applying some of this therapy to genealogy itself as a process, as a method, as a genre of writing. You know, why might we consider different metaphors for thinking about genealogy? I'm on the one hand, I'm very aware that, you know, people like philosophers like Nancy Fraser have a critique of Lacanian feminism, because, you know, people like Fraser say that changing the imaginary, changing the language we use about things that's not all we need for liberation. You know, if we change the language, that doesn't liberate oppressed people. We need to do more economically and materially to ensure that we're changing things. But nevertheless, language has its place, and I think it's important to think about the way we imagine things. And here's one of the places I want to sort of ask Christine about this, the waves metaphor, because I think beautifully in her paper, she shows how the wave metaphor is an instantiation of representing how women have just systematically been erased, that their voices are sort of passing out on the shore. And it's only by sort of being able to fix them in our bibliographies, in our testimonies, in the way that we write and teach, that we can ensure their presence. On the other hand, you know, this is perhaps reveals a sort of theologian I am. There's something about the wave metaphor that I actually do like. There are a couple of ways in which might one repurpose the wave metaphor. One of them is, I think, in Catherine Keller's work on creation. She incorporates the wave metaphor when used about women, the marine chaos that women represent in the Bible, for instance. She incorporates this into a positive understanding of female agency as a fluidity, an ability to absorb and drown the patriarchy and subsume and not just crash against it. But so that I appreciate Keller's way, but that's not my way of sort of grasping this metaphor. My way of grasping this metaphor is more an engagement with the sort of literature scholar and philosopher Denise Riley, who says that the implication of the waves of feminism figuration is that history can never catch woman in her totality. So in her work, Am I That Name, she says that the particular temporalities of women and the mercifully flickering nature of gendered self-consciousness are captured in this wave-like metaphor. So she says that the history of feminism since the 1790s, as you showed in your paper, Christine, has zigzagged and curved through incomplete oppositions, through time after time, the message being slightly different, the rights one being slightly different. But this swaying motion, she says, needn't be a cause for despair, and it needn't simply be a wonder. She says, if feminism is the voicing of women from the side of women, then it cannot but act out the full ambiguities of that category. So this reflection reduces some of the sting and mystery of feminism's ceaseless oscillations and allows us to prophesy to its next incarnation. So there's something very deeply historical about me and about the way I engage with the world that I quite like the sort of the way that waves can speak to the way that there's no final essential woman. There's a sort of mercifully flickering nature of gendered consciousness. So that would be my first sort of way of thinking with you. And then just finally, to wrap up before we go to questions, to talk about this sort of perspective of wholeness, I suppose. And this is, it's a thought, it's an incomplete thought, but it's a way of responding to what's already coming out in this conference, in the sense that the theologian must, and we heard this in John's response to Darren, the theologian must have a proper attention to history. That's a really important task. At the same time, the theologian must also honour transcendence. So I think where a genealogy cannot account for human difference, human temporality, in a way that allows God to be present in grace in the unlikeliest of places. So not simply one historical epoch or one particular way of being human, or the idea and the masculine as opposed to the feminine and the passive has so often been the binary way of conceiving gender in our world. I think that those two things in the construction of genealogy really must be held together by the theologian, an attention to history, but also an attention to transcendence. And it's this where I see your very helpful category of this theology of rupture coming in. And I think that category, when resting on an understanding of humanity, not as a binary separation between the masculine logos on the one hand and the feminine nature on the other, where femininity can become about mystique or the overgrown hedges outside of the polis. I think when we can overcome, as many feminists seek to do, in their, and a lot of feminists in the feminist in the sort of fourth wave feminism are looking towards wholeness and overcoming of division as the project, not arresting in division. And again, it sounds quite saccharine, but I genuinely think that this way of conceiving a proper theological anthropology, when put at the heart of the construction of genealogy, can be a very good thing, and it's a gender perspective that can help us get there. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for your wonderfully rich response once again. There are plenty of points to respond to, Christine, so I'll just give you an opportunity now before I bring in the other panelists. And meanwhile, everybody, it's welcome to put questions on the chat now. Christine.
I thank you, Ruth, for your just brilliant reading and thinking with me about the various aspects of genealogy. What really resonated with me was your repurposing of waves for a new kind of anthropology. And what I was thinking about when I was listening to you, I was thinking about the use of waves in the sense that you are imagining as one of freeing the male gender genealogy from the fixing of their particular bibliographies and footnotes in genealogy in a way that requires obedience to the tradition. And so I think I really take your point to heart that the wave metaphor can be used in generative ways in order to free genealogy from the kind of the constraints of fixing that we all know. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Christine. Now, let's bring all our panelists back. And if anyone would like to jump in, please raise your hand. I have Brad. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Really interesting. I very much appreciated what you had to say and am in sympathy with essentially all of it. Your articulation of the way in which you talked about the particular character of genealogy as it has come to be, articulated, expressed, debated, and so forth, is one of the reasons why, despite my respect for intellectual history, and indeed, I think the necessity of incorporating it, I could never be a straight up high intellectual historian. It overlooks way too much of human reality, human experience, and certainly because of the extraordinarily disproportionate way in which a small number of men over the overwhelming majority of human history have written the works that have been the most influential. Any would-be alternate genealogy of the same sort can only attempt to find other highly articulate, sophisticated texts to write an alternate genealogy. And to the extent that women and people of color and so forth, slaves, have been erased, good luck finding the quarry that you would need in order to, as it were, fight on the same terms. So that's one point I wanted to make. It's also the reason I don't have an investment, as I mentioned at the outset of my remarks, in genealogy per se. You articulated very well, I think, part of the reasons for that and things that I hadn't thought about before. I also would say that many of the things that you bring up in the erasure of women for history is also supplementary and part of why I think there's never been a Christian society. I'll just let that float out there. Because of inadequate attention to women as just as much as Jesus implied when he talks to the Samaritan woman, just as much as Paul saying there's neither man nor woman, right, slave nor free, all are one in Christ Jesus. But that's never had a conspicuous societal instantiation. At least I don't know of any on a wide scale. And finally, I like the way in which what you said implicitly critiques what I, in my paper, referred to as the quasi-Machiavellian character of the dominant idiom of the modern progressive narrative, which is to say, regardless of how we got here, oh yeah, we know there were bad things and it didn't go as planned and so forth, regardless of how we got here, thank goodness we're here, because here is way better than back there. And I think from an understanding and a look at the history of humanity through the lens of gender, through the lens of ethnicity or race, that is way more difficult to justify, and a fundamental critique of would-be, right, long-term narratives, whether genealogical or not. My constructive question for you, I'd just be interested to hear what you have to say about it. High intellectual history, I agree with your critique. As I'm sure you know, lots of historians of slavery, of colonialism, of material culture, of the family, the new social history, cultural history, gender history, and so forth, because of the problems that you articulate, have looked at other kinds of sources in order to try to recover, understand, right, and sympathetically present the kind of awareness of the fact that, last time I checked, human beings were male and female, really as far back into the sort of primatological evolutionary, scale you want to go, and any human history that doesn't pay attention to that is an inadequate history. So I just wondered if you see that as a kind of domain of raw material, as it were, to construct and write an alternate kind of genealogy. Because you can't, there's a sense in which, if I understood you well, you can't play in the same, you can't accept all the rules of the game and construct an alternative, right, high intellectual genealogy, because the product of what are the texts is itself the result of a very small preserve of male power transformed as it has been over time. Anyway, sorry for going on at such length. Thanks for your comments.
Christine.
Thank you, Brad, for your thinking with me about and with the other people who contributed today on the relations between genealogy, history, and theology of rupture. I think this discussion, and I'm looking forward to the days ahead in which we try to figure out how much history goes into genealogy. I would actually refer to Nietzsche, who is one of the fathers of genealogy, and he was actually not averse to connecting genealogical content to actual philological work. So I wouldn't pit those two in opposition. What I would say is that there is a kind of immanentism in genealogy and in history that, to refer to the title of our conference, the Theological Genealogies of Modernity, I think that theology has something to offer, critique, and correct in the immanentism that I think genealogists and historians are working with. I do think that theology has something to offer by way of looking at, and as Ruth elegantly put it, all times are equidistant to God, and as a theologian of grace, all times have dispensations of grace. They might not look the same, but all times have dispensations of grace. And on that grounds, I don't think that in my own work in genealogy, I would give a moral sort of valuation, which is better, which is worse. I do want to say that the contemporary time of women in women's permission to talk in public as theologians is very much a result of certain political forces in modernity. And so I'm actually thankful for those political forces that allow me and Ruth and my other women interlocutors to talk to you in public as theologians. That would not have been the case 100 years ago. So the fact that I am speaking to you today is really a product of certain political, social, and cultural forces for which I'm very grateful.
Thank you. Darren, do you want to come in?
Sure. Just a question about sort of ideas around or presuppositions of the need for having women in bibliographies. I mean, I mentioned in my paper that I thought that Torrance would be better off if he'd had more women in his bibliography. And you touch on that subject in general terms in your own paper. Sometimes that sort of push to be more inclusive in bibliographies sounds like it's being made on the assumption of a sort of gender essentialism. I don't think you're operating that way, but maybe you could just clarify how. Because a lot of times it sounds like people are saying more women should be in the bibliography because that way women's perspectives are represented. And it sounds like then that a women's perspective is a sort of essentialized thing. And we could list, at least in theory, you know, in bullet points, what a women's perspective amounts to. So I don't think that you're operating that way. I mean, Ruth herself repudiated the sort of essential woman idea. But if you aren't operating that way, maybe you could just clarify how you are operating, or what the assumption is if it isn't a gender essentialism there.
Thank you, Darren. So I hear you asking me about a recourse to an essentialist argument for feminist, the inclusion of women in genealogies. I do think, and this is on theoretical grounds, that feminist theology does, a feminist theology that has, does at some point have a recourse to essentialism, and feminist theologies that are absorbed and in dialogue with queer theologies might move in a way that releases feminist theology from, at bottom, an essentialist argument. I'm not so concerned with essentialism or those theoretical claims. What I am concerned about, and I've been a theologian for a very long time, and I have observed throughout my career that there is consistently and perniciously a deliberate erasure on by what I'm calling the theology of empire, of the theology of the disinherited, to use Howard Thurman's phrase. And this is, I think, something that is has a political implication, but I also am committed to the production of knowledge. And the production of knowledge that Schleiermacher taught us can never be one-sided, because one-sidedness does not represent truth. So I'm not interested in making kind of liberal arguments for inclusion. I think those have been critiqued by post-humanist and Black feminist scholars, Christina Sharp and Zakiya Iman-Jackson. But what I am interested in is inclusivity and dialogue with, not just inclusion for the sake of name dropping, which is, I think, a problem in genealogy as well, through this inscription of these consistent signifiers, but a real attempt for curiosity and attempt to learn, attempt to listen to those people who have something to say and are consistently silenced and erased. And I think that as a disposition, a cultivation of a disposition in the production of knowledge, rather than prima facie erase and diminish, actually to uplift and with a willingness to learn. And that, I think, is a disposition that theologians who are curious about their world, about history, about who is acting in history and why, I think that is a disposition that we can cultivate, and that will result in the a more holistic truth, in the sense that Ruth Ravenscroft has invited us to think about, as well as the kind of standard historical criterion of accuracy, representing history not from the perspective of the winners or the value of a certain theology of empire, but really being curious about the agents and the practitioners. And this requires a lot of work. This requires rearranging your syllabi. This requires paying attention to your footnotes and your bibliographies and who you are talking with. And it really requires intentionality. One doesn't do genealogy just by sleight of hand. one really has to be intentional. And that sometimes means reconstituting the entire way in which you have been trained, and then coming up with ways that are much more true, much more authentic, and represent humanity according to wholeness rather than one-sidedness.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are several very good and pertinent questions waiting, so I'm going to bring them in at this point. There's a question to you, Christine, from Asa, asking, do you think women are deliberately not fixed as signifiers? Or is it more subconscious decisions or hidden systematic biases that lead to this phenomenon that you talk about?
I'm wondering if Ruth, you also would have something to say about this. I think what I was trying to do was trying to explain the consistent erasure of women in theology and philosophy, and I see this in the contemporary discussion of Schleiermacher. There are just many brilliant women who are writing books, who are publishing, who have things to say about Schleiermacher, yet when I look at bibliographies of works written by white men on Schleiermacher, those women are not there. Those women have been disappeared. So what I was trying to explain, that phenomenon, that reality, from the perspective of Lacanian psychoanalysis, but I think you can explain it theologically with a doctrine of original sin. I think there are many ways of explaining women's erasure, and the fact that it continues to exist even today. So the problem is not going away, and so you can use different perspectives to explain this phenomenon, and hopefully by explaining the phenomenon, be intentional about correcting and transforming the situation.
Just to add to that, I think that's a really important point that Christine makes about this analogy with, well, it's not a non-analogy, it's sinful. It's racism and sexism are endemic social and original sins. And that distinction as well, perhaps that traditional distinction between original and active sin, which Schleiermacher talks about sin as a social thing. You know, it's structural, but it's also the what is latent in the social structure of the world is brought to bear in the acts of individual sinning. So things can both be latent and socially inculcated in a particular cultural structure, but then brought to bear in any given situation by just someone's intention. So I think it's a both and, not an either or, in the way that I think this understanding of humanity that underpins a genealogy has to properly take account of, and it seems to me that genealogy and the value of genealogies is also tied up with a question about freedom and determinism, or what you might want to call in the traditional terminology of liberty and necessity. You know, in the same way that we can look at stories of origin, you know, all the stories of origin you see, you know, I've got a good friend, John Mackenzie, who wrote an article about how comic books have turned from myth-making operations to origin story operations. You know, we've got a Cruella film coming out now, we had a Joker film, the Joker needn't have been as bad as he was. But this idea of freedom and determinism as warring powers in our world, I think having a better understanding of how those two things come together, we are both responsible for our actions at the same time as they are determined by our cultural spaces. So I think when we have to narrate the way that human history runs, we narrate how events have come to pass, that understanding of how freedom and determinism that underpins the way we write genealogies or understand genealogies also has to be there. So I think, yeah, that question about, do we deliberately leave women out or do we accidentally do so? I think that's wrapped up in this whole enterprise. Sorry, that was very waffly, but I hope I got to some points in the end.
Thank you for the input. Then Ruth, the next question is from Eskrid Sikahor, and is to Christine. Critique tends to be parasitic on what it critiques, as Rita Felsky argues. Rupture tends to need, for its radicality, a solidity to rupture, and therefore make the solidity to then perform the disruptive movement. Are women and people of color confined to working in the modes you have determined or delimited for us, rupture, critique, etc.?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And I would also invite Ruth to speak as well. Critique, I'd like to make the distinction between critique and criticism. Felsky's point about critique is that it turns humanities scholars into curmudgeons with their hand-wringing about the metaphysical will to power. I think the theological tradition has plenty of corrective, therapeutic, and constructive options to prevent the hand-wringing from working out in ethics, to cultivating dispositions, cultivating intentionalities, and drawing attention to truths that, or perspectives on truth that have been erased. So my invitation to you is to look at the criticisms of the ways in which genealogies have legitimated power and have inscribed certain narratives as obvious fact, and invite you to be intentional about theological dimensions of correction and construction. I'm not sure if I'm convinced that rupture is going to have a fixity to itself. I think Ruth's comments about waves and possibilities and transformations that are adjacent to the conditions under which we are all living are offering transcendent perspectives. But I think from the feminist perspective that you outlined, Ruth, I think that fixing of rupture is perhaps what Barth would have and Luther would have talked about, theologians trying to control God. But I invite you to comment as well.
Thank you, Christine. In response to this question about where's the space for women and people of color to write about these things, I want to turn to two writers that immediately spring to mind. One of them is Dolores Williams and her amazing book, Sisters in the Wilderness, where she attempts a rereading of the Hagar narrative. And by rereading, she doesn't seek to displace scripture, but rather to engage with it in a way that uncovers avenues not taken, possibilities there in the scriptural narrative. And of course, the story of Hagar is a narrative of exclusion. It's a woman who meets God in the wilderness, and God tells her to go back to her slave owner. So Williams, in that context, is dealing with a narrative that's sort of sidelined, but is nevertheless a generative narrative. It's a narrative that has given hope, Williams says, to countless generations of Afro-American women in communities, and the communities that she was writing in the 90s. So that's one way, rereading as a kind of working within the rupture that is creative and generative and provides people with a narrative for living. It provides, Dolores Williams talks about survival. It's not living, it's survival, Hagar's way of living, but nevertheless it's a way of maintaining. So rupture is not just about slicing up and dicing up. It's about, it can be about finding a way in and working how to dwell in the rupture and dwell in the difficulty. The other person that springs to mind is Audre Lorde, who I was reading while I was reading Christine's paper this week, whose whole project is one of reunification, of wholeness making. Her interventions, her poetry are meant to expose trauma and expose exclusion. There's this amazing letter to Mary Daly that some of you may have read, where she calls Mary Daly out for citing women of color in her work, but using them as instruments to make her point. She sort of read a cursory set of articles by people like Lorde and has sort of just puts them in her argument and sort of instrumentalizes them. And Lorde's like, that's not the way to work with us. So what Lorde's project, again, is an example of someone who's not simply working in the rupture and working as a critic, but is doing that, but is also seeking to build a new language of recovery, of a way of speaking through difference and within difference with people from all sorts of different communities. So I think feminism is not, as Christine has been saying, is not constrained to these this breaking up, this shining a light on the injustices in our world. It's also about where we go from there. So again, it's a bit waffly, but read some Audre Lorde, is what I would say.
Just to kick off that discussion, because somebody else also raised this question of what women of color would you list in your intellectual genealogy? This is open to all. The question, I guess, is just simply an opportunity for you to be a bit more concrete about the way you envisage, what the implications of Christine's argument, I guess, in the writing of genealogy. Anyone want to have contribute?
Who are you asking for? People who've influenced us, or
No, I think
people who are genealogists themselves?
I think the question meant, what women of color would you list? In other words, in your in a genealogy, in the traditional sense, which attends, if I understand the question correctly, that attends more deeply to some of these erasure that Christine was mentioning in her arguments. What do you have particular persons in mind, I guess, that mark out significant cases? I guess that's the way I read the question, but I think the question is quite brief.
Yes, and I thank the person who articulated that question, because that that indicates an openness to learn and to listen. I think as theologians of the word, we're so quick to speak, but I think listening as a practice is important as we dig for, as we educate ourselves about the voices that we are interested in hearing, but have been erased. I would just point you to, there are lots of resources out there. Cornell West has a syllabus online on, I think, the former Harvard Divinity School website, on a list of works by African-American authors who are important as we decolonize the curriculum. There are websites to help the education of looking and being curious about people who have things to say but who haven't traditionally been listened to. So there are lots of resources online that would help you as you begin this process of discovery and joy in learning from different people about their context, their ideas, and especially their theological ideas about God.